everyone. Thanks for joining us today for a discussion on addressing technical skill gaps on your engineering team. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Skiller Whale. So the webinar will last about 45 minutes, and after that, we'll all head over to the lead dev Slack and we'll answer any remaining questions in the Effective Teams channel. If you have any questions during the panel, feel free to pop them in the Q&A feature, and we'll either weave them into the panel or address them at the end. So let's start off with some introductions. My name is Jean Su. I'm the VP of Engineering here at Range. And today I'll be joined by Tanaka, Lindsay, Tal, and Howell. And they'll be sharing their experiences and insights. So to start us off, I think I'm just going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. So provide a short summary of who you are, what you do, and maybe why you're excited to be on the panel today. Tanaka, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Tanaka Mutakwa, and I work as the VP of Engineering at a startup called Names and Faces. I'm very passionate about building high-performing teams and helping engineers grow and have fulfilling careers. And yeah, I'm excited to be part of this panel today and looking forward to sharing some insights from my experiences.
Thank you, Tanaka. Lindsay?
Hi, folks. My name is Lindsay Blimus. I'm also a VP of Engineering. I work at Nubank, which is a Latin American fintech company. Prior to that, I worked in e-commerce and in defense engineering. So I've been really happy to see how technology and team building applies across a wide range of industries. So I'm really excited to be here today too.
Thanks, Lindsay. And Tal?
So I'm Tal. I work as a development group leader in Nielsen, the Tel Aviv office out of Israel. I'm really excited to, I think it's a very important topic, and I'm really into management stuff. So I think it's a very interesting topic, often not being addressed enough in our industry.
Glad to have you here. And Howell?
I'm Howell. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Skiller Whale. We're a SaaS company that enables development of developers through targeted capability training. And that's because I'm very passionate about learning and about training, and that I think that effective training requires four things to be true: that it's individually personalized, that it's led live by experts, it's hands-on, and it has to be sustainable. It has to be kind of part of the fabric and the furniture of the company, and that's how you get real results from it. And then I've spent the last 10 years working in VC-backed startups, often as a CTO, sometimes as a mentor and coach, and also running a dinner club for CTOs. And one of the things that I have become extremely passionate about as a result of that is leadership and the kind of contextual nitty-gritty decisions that engineering leaders have to face.
Thanks, Hal. I wanted to share a brief story that I thought of yesterday, which was very relevant to this panel and kind of this industry that we're in of constant learning and skill gaps, which is many years ago, I was a few years into my career, and I had started at Medium as one of the first engineers. And I remember talking to my parents occasionally on the phone, and, you know, my dad, there's not a lot for us to talk about, but he'd always ask like, oh, how are you doing? And, you know, how's your job? Are you still learning a lot? And I'm like, yeah, I'm still learning a lot. He's like, oh, that's good. That's good. And then that would be like about it for our conversation. And every few months he'd ask me this, and I was still learning a lot. So I'd say, yeah, I'm still learning a lot. And he's from a medical career. So I think it's a little bit different. Like the learning kind of all happens up front. And so about a year and a half into my role at Medium, you know, he asks me, oh, are you still learning a lot? I'm like, yeah, I'm still learning a lot. He's like, it's been a year and a half. Like, when are you going to start contributing? And I realized that he just thought like I was just learning and not contributing anything for that whole year and a half, which was very eye-opening. I don't know what he thought the company was thinking and hiring someone that wouldn't contribute for a year and a half. But I think that just goes to show like this career is one of constant learning, and skill gaps are inevitable. Everyone has them. And so what we're going to talk about is really, you know, how do you identify them? How do you fill them on your team? You know, do you hire externally or train internally? All these sorts of topics. So Just a funny story, an anecdote. But maybe to start us off, we can talk about a little bit about like, how do you actually identify skill gaps, right? How do you think about them? Do you look at the team as a whole, or are you looking and trying to identify skill gaps in individual engineers? Tal, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So my take on this is kind of like a combination of both, because the way I see it, the team has as a team needs to have certain amounts of skills in order to tackle the tasks at hand. But individuals within that team could have different skills in different areas. So for me, if I could visualize here like a spider chart, right, with all the different skills that needed for the team, you can imagine that like some person could be very high on some skill and low on other skills, but as long as the entire team have enough people that have a good coverage of the skills needed, so that's what we need. And then like to identify the gaps, we look, okay, what's the responsibilities of the teams, and do I have at least like one person, hopefully more than one, that is very capable in this area. And if I don't have anyone, like let's say I'm a web application team that has front-end, back-end developers, and we're also doing, testing and DevOps, and I have no one that is really strong in how to test code properly, right? Then it means I have a gap, right? And this is kind of like, if you can imagine a spider chart, like a way to think about that. Okay, I'll give the talking stick to someone else, because otherwise I'll talk forever.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on this one. I think it's really interesting when talking about individuals in particular. I love the spider web visual for the team, but for an individual, I think there's this tension between specialist and generalist always, yes. And we need both, right? For that one, I try to explain like the T shape, right? Everyone needs a little bit of general and a little bit of specialist. And I think you don't want to go too far in either direction. Like you don't want everyone to be the same, right? Because then you don't have really deep knowledge on any one specialty. But then also you don't want, your front end and your back end engineers to be completely separate and not able to even touch the other side, right? You want some flexibility and people to be able to solve their own problems as much as possible, right?
Yeah, if I can jump in next, I think, yeah, you have to consider both together, because the team is the sum of the individuals, but you also can't change the team level skills without changing the individual skills, right? I don't know, there's a way of changing skills without changing team skills without changing individual skills. I think the difference though is that I think the individual skills tell you the worst you could possibly achieve on a given project, right? Because if that individual is working in isolation, it doesn't matter if everyone else on the team is amazing at testing and debugging. That individual skills kind of tell you the minimum bar that project could achieve, where the team level skills tell you the best that you could hope for from a project. Because if everyone's mobbing on something, then hopefully their skills combined form that team level outcome. I think the half of your question was about how you work out where those skill gaps are and how you identify them. And I think that can seem really hard, because skills are really about capability. You can look at things like pull requests and past work, feedback, but all of those are going to be a bit haphazard because they're based on the work that has been done, which is typically done under a certain set of constraints. It doesn't tell you what someone could have done in a different scenario or in a different situation. And so I think if you want to find those skill gaps, then you need some kind of comprehensive analysis. So I don't mean like you are a 7 out of 9 junior engineer and get 2 out of 9 more and we'll make you a mid-level. I mean, you want to know, does this person understand when to use composition versus inheritance? Does this person understand like advanced features of the technologies that they're using, know when to use them appropriately? Do they know the difference between like these built-in types like lists and sets and the performance characteristics of both of them so they can make intelligent decisions? I think when you've got that analysis that's not limited by the scope of work or the constraints on that work, that gives you something very actionable, because it gives you that radar graph that Tao was talking about, the spider type diagram that shows you the skills, but it also gives you the like very detailed, I can improve that section of the radar graph, the spider graph, sorry, by changing this person's skills in that area.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks. Tanaka, do you have anything to add for just sort of how to think about and how to identify skill gaps on a team?
So I think with identifying the gaps in the team, something useful is actually feedback if it's on a team perspective, feedback from other teams around how that team is working within the company. If it's on an individual perspective, then feedback from peers of that individual. Because usually, I guess you can ask one individual what they think they want to grow in and what they want to learn and develop, and they probably have a good sense of that. But then they probably have blind spots, which their peers can identify, and then you can then take that information and combine it together to decide what to upskill or what the individual needs to upskill on, or what a specific team needs to sort of look at if they're looking to upskill. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
If I can add just on this point, because I think what really helped us, because we're a part of like a very big company, but we're not like, we're kind of like in isolation in some sense. And what helped us get what Tanaka was mentioning, like some kind of like another team feedback, was doing collaboration with other groups outside of our company. If it's by attending meetups or hosting meetups and seeing different types of lectures, or trying to contribute to open source projects on the same kind of like technologies we use, it gives you a lot to see, to get like a code review from someone who's like on working on a project, but it's no connection related to you. So it gives you some sense of where you stand, right? And going back to the spider chart, so I really agree with what Lindsay said about the T-shape, right? And you really want to make sure you have specialists in at least one in each area, and those could be your compass, like within the company. And we want to make sure those people get feedback from outside, so we have some sense of making sure that we're able to identify gaps if we have them. And we don't have to be perfect at anything, right? At everything.
Mm-hmm. So once we've talked about a few different ways to identify gaps, either for individuals or teams. Once you've kind of identified them, what have you all found effective in ways to fill them, whether that's training folks internally, kind of casually through like, just working with someone more senior, or hiring externally for those skill sets, and how much do you actually gear your hiring to specific skill sets, or external resources like Skill or Whale or something like that? What's worked well for you and your teams? Let's see. Howell, you want to start us off? You may have some thoughts on this.
I certainly have some thoughts about Skill or Whale. I can talk about the reason for starting Skill or Whale. Maybe that's better than me just talking about how great the company is. I find hiring very, very time consuming, and it's time consuming of the most senior people in a team typically, which makes it expensive. Added to all of the other aspects of hiring, that it's slow, it comes with all the dead ends and false starts that can be really frustrating. So for me, hiring, when it comes to capabilities of my team, hiring is essentially a last resort. There are reasons for it to be a first resort, like if there's more that I want to be done in parallel, specifically if that's a requirement, or if there are kind of intangible skills that I can't achieve via training. So an example of that would be like the diversity of my team. I don't think you can train diversity. I think you can train for people to have better thinking around diversity, but that's not the same thing at all. And so I think that is one case where it's very obvious to me that you need to hire. But I think if what you need is a capability change, then I always wanted to train the existing team, and my frustration with existing training was essentially why Skill or Whale was started, because I wanted ways of taking an existing team and essentially injecting new capabilities into them. I could see these gaps, but I had no way of really filling in the gaps. And the existing options I had were things like pairing, which is very dependent on the skills and also the kind of ego of the seniors who are doing the pairing. One of the things I find with some senior developers can be they don't see beyond their own opinions to the kind of context behind them. And so you hear, PHP is a terrible language, but of course there are many very successful companies that use almost exclusively PHP, and that's not a useful form of training. Plus all of the things of it being very kind of contextual to the work that's being done. I separate learning into the kind of three different broad areas of knowledge, skills, and wisdom. My knowledge is kind of data and facts and, call this method on this API and this thing will happen. Skills is kind of how to solve a problem, how to think about something potentially. And then wisdom is kind of contextual decision making. Wisdom is especially hard to teach, and I think it's something that senior developers can be good at, but are generally very bad at seeing beyond the context for their own decisions. And that means that learning from pairing can be really limited. Skill learning, I think you want to abstract away from the problem that's being worked on, because you can then talk about the kind of the contextual decisions behind it, but also have that iterated practice, because the best way to learn skills is trial and error, hands-on kind of challenge-based learning, so that you can hear about some new topic. I don't know, list comprehensions in Python is always my go-to for this. I don't know why. You can hear about some new topic, go and try it, and then have the things that you misunderstood like built upon and worked with until you do understand them, and kind of built up slowly through hands-on experience. And so I think you can bring in skills via hiring. It's just slow. And I think training has the ability to be really effective. It's just that lots of training super isn't.
Yeah, it's also very expensive. I just started talking to some recruiters and they're charging a lot these days. Anyone else in terms of like of things that have you found effective in filling these gaps internally or externally?
Well, I wanted to add, it's not necessarily about the effectiveness, but I think the decision about hiring versus training, there's a lot of context there too, right? Sometimes, you hire for other reasons. It could be volume, not skills necessarily, and things like that. But I think another piece is, technology stacks are very different. In my prior role, we used a technology stack that was very common, very easy to hire for. And Nubank uses a functional programming language called Clojure, and it is very hard to hire for. So there is very little hiring for those skills, and it's all training, right? So I think it's really nice to see when a company invests in training and in growing the people that they have. So a big +1 to that help. But I think, that doesn't mean that hiring is not also a solution for the long term. I think part of that wisdom piece also is having seen things done before, right? And kind of knowing how things play out. There's also, especially in terms of seniority, over time, you've just seen more and more things, which means you've had more chances to see things that happen rarely. A colleague of mine talks about this a lot, and I really like his framing of that seniority of like, over time, you've had more exposure to rare events, and that can be really valuable for a team as well. So sometimes that is also something worth hiring for.
Yeah. It sounds like the hiring can be obviously useful. I mean, everyone's hiring a lot, but hiring for specific technical skill sets is not something that, depending on the team size, right? Like we're a team that's like the backend's in Go, and I'm really looking to hire a backend Go developer. But if for example, this person has had really good, proven experience at an early startup, and has a lot of backend experience and experience picking up different languages, then it's like, well, they'll just pick it up as well, right? So I think one thing that's been top of mind for a lot of managers that I've been speaking to across a lot of different companies is how do you support especially more junior engineers, in an office space. I mean, Howell, you're talking a lot about like very explicit setups with like Skill or Whale and getting like very individual customized training. But I think a way that, in the absence of that, a way that a lot of junior engineers level up is like sitting next to someone who's more senior and having that person, lean over and be like, hey, have you tried this? Or just like observing like someone and what they're doing, and maybe pairing with them for a few minutes a day. In the absence of that, especially as a lot of people are working remotely, I think people have been finding it really challenging for junior folks to get the same level of support, especially when it can feel hard to like get on Slack and be like, hey, I really need help, right? As compared to just like mentioning something to someone at lunchtime. What's been useful for you all in terms of really supporting and leveling up junior folks who probably just have more general skill gaps than anyone else? Tanaka, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. I think the one thing, once like a company switches to remote or is set up in a fully remote environment, is the culture has to be more explicit about things that used to happen, like whether you are just having lunch with your fellow developers and you start having a discussion and you're actually learning through that. You miss all those things. And like I said, maybe you just get stuck and you walk off from your desk, walk up to another developer and ask for help and immediately get help. That also, things like that get lost. And information that's probably in people's heads that's not documented is also just lost in a remote space. So it's about being more explicit and building a more collaborative culture, I think. So an example of something that's worked for us and that we've done is not only for junior engineers, actually, is when a new engineer joins our team, the team they're placed in, they basically do a lot of pair programming and mob programming with the engineers in their first few, at least, weeks with the engineers on their team they are working with, helping to just build their relationships with their teammates, get any information they need almost on those calls as questions come up, and also learn the code base from people who are used to navigating it. So that's one side of it. I think there's more collaboration needed in the remote environment, but then there's the other side around the documentation. Information that we normally think is fine to store in our heads or two people know about it. It's better to put it on some platform, whatever documentation platform your company uses, so that someone can find it easily or gets it as part of their onboarding pack. And then one last thing I'll mention is around sort of the support. Technology leaders or managers should have, especially in a more remote setting for the engineers, it becomes more important to have those frequent check-ins, finding out how someone is doing, where they need your support, keeping them accountable for the upskilling goals they set, and just always being around to make sure they don't get lost and like you're forgotten in your own space at home. So yeah, I think quite a few things that can be looked at to just handle the remote challenges.
Yeah, definitely.
Go
ahead. Go ahead, Lindsay.
I was gonna say, I've seen a couple teams do an exercise where they actually have folks on the team share their own development plans with the rest of the team. This obviously requires a very high level of trust with the team and vulnerability and things like that. But in a really strong team, it's really nice to be able to show your peers, like, here's what I'm working on, here are what my skill gaps are. So everyone's sort of aware, and then it makes it a little bit easier to reach out and be able to go to a colleague and say like, hey, remember I'm working on this thing. It came up in this project. Could you help me out? And I think that can sort of open the door sometimes.
I think finding like process and systematic ways to surface some of the stuff that comes up more naturally in an office setting can be important. One of the things we're experimenting with is like, I was talking to someone in a one-on-one, we realized some of the kind of individual process things are very hidden right now. So it's like, what do you do when you get stuck, right? Some people are like, oh, I just asked for help. Most people are like, well, I try to figure it out by myself, in different degrees of that, right? Like one person I talked to was like, oh, I try to exhaust all my ideas before I ask anyone for help. And like, that may be 10 to 12 ideas. I'm like, oh my God, like, please do not do that. like definitely don't do that. So getting people more aligned and like, hey, let's all agree that if you get stuck, Google it, search for help for maybe half an hour or an hour, and then reach out and ask for help. And so we've been trying to do things of like, in like end of meeting, we'll have like a prompt that's like, hey, how do you keep track of your to-do items? Or like when you get a new feature assigned to you, like what's your process? And just kind of getting some visibility into what other people do so that it might bring more ideas to everyone. Yeah, Hal.
I think this question of juniors getting stuck, when it really has two parts to it. There's one that's like the domain specific stuff. There's like our company and what we do, and oh, this system breaks all the time, and you just have to, I don't know, restart IIS or whatever it is. And then there's the kind of I'm a junior who's still learning, and I feel like the part of onboarding and getting people used to systems, I think, is true across the kind of range of abilities of software developers. So I know someone who joined a new company during lockdown who's been a software developer for 14 years, and it was really hard to kind of get into a stack and start getting productive, because all those questions that you normally lean over and ask the person behind you weren't anything like so easy. And I think with those things, I've heard of companies that have like all day pairing, essentially, like video camera on all the time for people's first week. I feel like that's probably quite exhausting, but you could do it for half days at a time or something, just so it is as easy as kind of starting a conversation. Oh gosh, I've forgotten the name of the company, but there's like companies that are very well set up for that form of video conferencing. I think for the more kind of skills based, I'm a junior who needs to level up, I actually think that same problem also exists across the whole spectrum of software abilities. It's just for your seniors, it looks a bit more different. It looks more like I want to chat to the other seniors to kind of bounce these ideas off them, like these 3 different ways I might approach this design. And I think in all of those cases, I think those can be found analytically. If what you have is a good analytical, individualized approach to training, you should be able to identify those gaps that this junior developer isn't very strong at debugging, doesn't really understand what a breakpoint is, doesn't know how to inspect the values in a variable, and doesn't have to get the program to the right state to start kind of inspecting those variables at all. And then I think if you're able to fix those skills, you can enable them independently to overcome those kinds of problems. But of course, it doesn't fix the domain level problems, which I think you need a different solution for.
Right. So being really explicit and clear with yourself and with your team on what types of problems can be addressed externally with like one-on-one training, and what can be only addressed by people on your team who have been there and know the systems.
Right.
Yeah. Tall. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing, which I think is important, is kind of like having a culture of make sure it's okay to ask questions, and make sure people understand it's part of their role to help each other, regardless of seniority. And I think this is crucial, because if the higher the barrier for someone to reach out and ask a question is, the least likely it will happen. So when we talked about hiring for skills versus training for skills, training someone to be friendly, I at least found it to be hard. So when we hire, and we're in the software industry, we hire all the time because there's for different reasons, not always good reasons, but could be churn, could be other stuff. I always make sure we hire friendly people that want to help each other and like to ask questions. If people are have the mindset of continuously learning, they understand why would someone ask them a question, right? And they would understand how it is to be on the side of someone that doesn't know something. Because if you feel like you know everything, something is up. It's not possible. You cannot learn everything. So this is like very important for me. And I always tell guys when they first join, look, we're a friendly group of people. Feel free to reach out to whoever you see fit, and we will reach out to you to ask you if you need something before, but feel free. And just like one small additional thing, we need to make sure that we don't only talk the talk, we actually walk the walk. So as managers, we should be able to ask stupid questions, right? And feel comfortable with letting people know we have gaps in our skills, and reaching out and getting assistance from other people. They will feel it's okay. It's okay to not know something.
It's hard. I try to ask all my basic questions as publicly as possible on Slack so everyone sees it. But I used to do training like leadership development for engineering managers and engineers. And we had this section where we would ask people to share the stories they make up that prevent them from asking for help. And there'd be like, well, the basic ones, like people are going to think I'm stupid. You know, I waited too long to ask for help. So now it's like embarrassing that I'm asking and that I haven't had any progress in this whole period of time. And some of them were really creative, like by asking for help, like I'm going to expose this person's knowledge gaps because they may not know how to help me. And so it's just all over the place. There's a ton of stories people make up that prevent them from asking for help.
Yeah, and imposter syndrome is also a big aspect that we need to make sure we give feedback to people. Look, you're in the right place. You're doing a good job. Feel free to ask questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also want to add one more thing. You mentioned like having that learning mindset, and I don't want to roll right past that. That's so important, right? I think if you're trying to address skills gaps, it's so much easier when the people on your team want to do that for themselves as well, right? And are curious and motivated to learn. And it's funny, Jean, when you told your opening story about being asked, are you learning in your job? I thought it was going the other direction, where it was like, well, the minute you're done learning, you should be out of there, right? So that's
what I thought too. Because I was like, oh, I need to keep reassuring him that I'm still learning something. And then it just took this like...
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, so I think that, having people with that mindset helps us a lot, and everyone on your team should be enthusiastic about learning more things.
I mean, I think people love learning. My experience, I've heard that there are software developers who don't like learning, but I've yet to meet one. I've met ones who dislike training. I mean, I dislike the majority of training as well. Like I fully get that training can be like boring as anything, but I've not met anyone who doesn't like learning, because I think, particularly in technology, I think learning can feel like such a superpower. Like, oh, what an idiot I was 3 hours ago when I was solving the problem that way. I could have been doing it this way. Now, like I've like leveled up as a software developer, and now everything is going to be so much better. I feel like it motivates a team, and it's, as Tao was saying, it makes it, it lets you focus your hiring on the things that you can't change. You can't really teach kindness. You can't really teach passion. And so if you can find those things, then the technical skills can essentially be put in place later.
Yeah, we've got a question. Let's see. Interesting. Do you track soft skills in the same way you track for hard skills? And maybe especially for hiring, I think this has been brought up a few times. Like, if you're not hiring for specific technical skill sets, what are the attributes that you are hiring for?
If I can say, I will say yes, like with, 4, proclamation marks. Yes, we are making sure soft skills are addressed. I think it's super important. I mean, I've talked a little about this, and other people here have talked about this. Learning is a soft skill, and being a team player and being accountable, and all of these that's all soft skills, and they're crucial. I think in many cases, they are even more important, especially if we talked about juniors before, especially there, because the soft skills matter less, right? If I hire a junior person, I expect less when it comes to hard skills, like technical knowledge. And I expect a lot. I expect them to come like with the utmost motivation to learn and to engage, right? But it's also very true if you're like a super senior person who's been working in the industry for 30 years, you want those persons to be, have good soft skills as well, and not sit in the corner and, give mean looks to everyone.
I think it's especially important for the senior folks, right? Because they could be scary, right?
Yeah.
Even the nicest senior person can be scary to a junior just based on their title, right? So making sure that those folks are able to proactively develop relationships. But to the question, I agree. I think it's equally important. I think the industry went through this moment a while back where this concept of like the 10x engineer, right, was like so good that they could be a jerk and it was fine. And then everyone was like, no, that's a terrible idea. Like,
that actually means you're not a good engineer.
I've seen it somewhere that a 10x developer could be someone that makes 5 developers 2 times better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I used to run the trainings I would used to run for engineers who are kind of stepping into leadership. That's kind of what we found is that, I mean, these were engineers who were really solid, right? They were senior or senior plus. And so for almost all of them, it wasn't technical skills that was their bottleneck. It was, learning how to get buy-in from cross-functional leads, how to communicate about their team's work in a way that other people understood the impact. And so I think once you get to a certain point, like that, those are the sort of skills that are common skill gaps at that level.
Yeah, I think communication is key and it has many aspects, but being able to communicate, if it's to present what you're thinking about or to get buy-in for someone or to give someone feedback, I think those are, again, I don't think I've seen development done in isolation, but never every person has its own project. I mean, I've seen it, well, it wasn't going well. So when we work as a team, communication is super important.
Going back to go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to add to say that I think the soft skills become more important as you become more senior, but the best time to learn and train for them is as soon as someone starts their career. Like you just find it easier if you start picking up like how to communicate well, how to work well in a team, how to think about how the rest of the team is feeling and how to handle conflict with teammates and things like that. If you learn them much earlier in your career, it serves you all throughout your journey. So I think the usual mistake is people start learning them when they get a leadership role, which is like 6 to 10 years into their career. And it's much more difficult to change your behaviors at that point. So something also as if you're trying to upskill juniors is, of course, there's a lot of the technical skills to help them learn and grow, but there should also be an element of the soft skills added to that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things we see a lot actually is that the senior developers are assumed to have no technical skill gaps. And I think what I've inferred from that is that the skill gaps that senior engineers have don't reveal themselves for the timescale of 6 months kind of time. Where a junior, their mistakes might show up as a production bug in the next week or something. Whereas a senior who's typically got more of a kind of architectural role is thinking about the longer term, their lack of knowledge or understanding about domain-driven design or about a particular design pattern or some advanced language feature that they kind of develop this 1,000-line hacky way around because they don't know that it exists, causes problems in the longer term, but less obviously now. And so one thing we frequently find is actually people are surprised at the level of learning that's still left for their seniors, and particularly on technical skills. I think the soft skills are, there's kind of two parts to that, the kind of purpose of increasing those. One is the kind of career progression frameworks that a lot of companies at least will have in place, where there'll be different strands of ability that you look for in each level in a particular role. And so there's part of this conversation which is improving people's skills in those softer areas to kind of level them up in those parts of their career ladders. And then there's another part which is just the day-to-day stuff that so quickly surfaces. If someone does fit that mold of the 10x engineer who's kind of 0.1x for everyone else on the team, that really quickly becomes obvious. And the soft skills become all or nothing. It doesn't matter how good your hard skills are if you're a real pain to work with. You have to fix those.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about sort of what you can do on a team, hiring for a team, training internally on a team. If we zoom out and think about, a company at scale, how or when do you think about building training in more systematically at the company level? Lindsay, I know you had some thoughts about this.
Yeah, I like this one. Especially with teams growing very quickly. I think it's important not to just think about any one team, but take a step back and say, hey, is the skill gap on my team, is that everywhere in the company, right? Is it just my team? And if you see patterns, right, there's opportunity to reduce the load of some of that, right? And kind of abstract away some of the details. So whether it's just a learning program, right, courses or things like that, or whether it's like a boot camp for your juniors, right? If you say like, hey, we're hiring all these juniors, it takes us a lot of time to teach them to do A, B, and C. Why don't we do 2 weeks up front, right? Like hire people in batches, give them a cohort so that they have a network and they feel supported, and then teach them these things together. And then by the time they join teams, they're ready to go, and it reduces the burden on individual teams. So things like that, taking that sort of systematic engineering approach, even to team building at scale, can be really helpful.
Yeah, maybe piloting things that maybe don't scale and then learning from it and then figuring out what to do at scale.
Yeah, exactly.
Tal, anything you want to add here? Anything you found useful?
So I'll just say I don't have much experience in scaling this up, but I have experience in introducing these type of things, kind of like bottom up. Yeah, I always get confused which ways. So I'll just say that everything we've discussed today could be very easily introduced by even a team leader or just like a technical leader of any capacity. The entire organization doesn't have to work like this and to identify skill gaps and address them. Each manager, like within his or hers, scope, can do it. And I think what really helps with scaling this up is seeing success. So if you start something and it works well, other places in the company would like to do the same. But I haven't done like a full-fledged company level. I cannot speak to that.
But I think that's a good point about learning from your peer leaders also, right? Like figuring out what has worked for people on other teams in your company and figuring out if you can combine forces or trade knowledge, things like that.
Yeah, and it's important to also talk about it for that to actually be able to happen. So if you have peer meetings or any other type of internal discussion, and by the way, if you don't have peer sessions with your peers, you should, but it's a different topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked about how junior folks can be somewhat isolated in this remote working world, but so too can anyone else at every level, right? Everyone's kind of if without some intentional like peer meetings or leadership circles, people can be isolated from others. And yeah, even a quick meeting of like, hey, what's working well? And people might bring up, oh, I tried this training with one of my junior engineers. It worked really well. So yeah, how?
One thing that makes me a bit nervous about this question is the tying of systematic and kind of formalized training to the idea of a boot camp, because I think I said at the beginning that I think there are 4 things that make training really effective, and I think boot camps are great for being challenge-based. They're great for having an expert that leads them. But one of the things, when you ask people what they want from learning, more than 90% say they want learning that's personalized and learning that's flexible. And I think you can still have systematized learning with those constraints. But one of the problems with the kind of factory model is you risk really turning people off learning. Like if the kind of first week of a bootcamp process is something that people already know, and it's going to depend on who your intake is, but that certainly can be the case if you're taking, let's say, computer science graduates into your bootcamp. They might already know the programming language that you're teaching them. I think if you want to keep people really engaged and make that time be as effective as possible, then you need to first analyze where learning is going to be relevant for each individual, and then try and make learning be in small doses so that it can fit around work. And this is how Skillaware works, but it's also something that you can, there's nothing stopping anyone else doing the same thing. We do an analysis of people in a team so you can get that kind of granular understanding, map it up to that radar graph, spider graph type diagram so you can understand on the broad level where someone would benefit from learning, and then fill in those gaps in this approach that allows people to still be productive and practice what they've learned from session 1 before they come back for the second hour, 1 week or 2 weeks later. And I haven't run a boot camp that way, but I imagine the same, I think you could try and rethink the bootcamp model to enable that and enable that earlier productivity.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got to wrap up, but I wanted to note that we've got a lot of good options for if you want to identify and fill in some skill gaps on your team, some ideas for doing that at scale. And one thing that came up was really getting clear on what type of skill gap you're filling, right? Is it a communication, like be kind and be supportive of your fellow engineers? Is it how do I work in this specific system? Are these, is this graph normal? These sorts of questions. Or is it like, hey, I'm not familiar with this specific concept in this language? Because each of those will have different solutions that are more effective. Also, don't wait for your company to have a program in place. Like a lot of these things are bottoms up. There's a lot of ways that you can drive it and then share your learnings in one of these peer groups or with your manager, and then try to get that spread through the company. So thank you all so much for all the good insights today. And we'll be heading over to the Lead Dev Slack and the Effectives Teams channel. So thanks for joining, and we hope to see you next time.